After spending a month with the iPad 9, I believe that it's an even better value than I initially thought. So here's all the information you need to know to see if it's a good fit for you. When I review a product, a major part of my framework for the review revolves around the price, right? I mean, I can't expect a $500 device to be as good as a $1,000 one, although there have been some pretty interesting surprises. The iPad 9 is Apple's entry-level model, and it sells for $329 if you're looking for the 64 gig Wi-Fi model, then $479 for the 256 gig model. So that's about $170 less than the iPad Mini 6 and about $270 less than the iPad Air 4. I'm not gonna bring up the iPad Pro right now because I don't think that a lot of people are choosing between these two devices. And when it comes to actual use, whenever I reach for an iPad, my first choice has to do with size because I'm trying to pick the best option for what I need. And if I'm doing some mobile gaming, I may want a completely different device than the one that I would choose to surf the web or to use with a keyboard case. The iPad 9 is in the middle of the iPad lineup in terms of size. It's not exactly the same footprint as the iPad Air 4 and the 11-inch iPad Pro, but in terms of handling and portability, I don't notice a significant enough difference to the point where it would make me choose one of the other two. Now, I like the design of the iPad Air 4 and the iPad Pro better because we're getting smaller bezels, a larger display with a similar footprint, a higher resolution, a better orientation for speakers, and a more powerful port. But as far as the actual size of the device and even the size of the display, the difference isn't significant enough, at least for me. Now, one area where I do notice a difference is biometric authentication. So of course, we still have the traditional home button on the iPad 9 with Touch ID. It's fast, it's reliable, and it's worked perfectly for me, just like it did on the iPad 8. Now, the one thing that I noticed is that I need to register both my thumbs and both my index fingers so that I can easily authenticate in every orientation. So if I pick up the iPad 9, I'm always using one of my thumbs. But if it's laying flat on the table, then it's easier to use an index finger. With the iPad Air 4, I never use my thumbs because the new Touch ID is incorporated into the power button at the top. And of course, the iPad Pro has Face ID, which is really convenient. If I had one request, it would be that Apple would offer both Touch ID and Face ID on every iPad, so that every user can just pick what works best for their situation. And that is something that I appreciate on some of my Samsung tablets. Now I want to talk about my experience with the display, because I do my best to read all of your comments and I get a lot of questions about it. I do everything on the iPad 9 that I do on my more expensive iPads. I play games, I surf the web, I take notes and sketch with the Apple Pencil, I watch videos, I work on videos for the channel, and for everything that I do, the 10.2-inch Retina display has been excellent. Yes, the 2160 by 1620 resolution is slightly lower than the resolution on the 10.9-inch iPad Air 4 and the 11-inch iPad Pro, but that hasn't really translated into an inferior user experience for the majority of what I do. There is a difference in the type of the display though. So the iPad 9 has a non-laminated display which has an air gap, and the iPad Air 4 and the iPad Pro have a fully laminated screen. That means that the display, the touch layer, and the cover glass are fused together. If I'm watching video, playing games, or using any of the apps on the iPads, I don't really notice the difference. And like I said in my initial review, with the black bezels, it's practically impossible for me to even show you the air gap. On the iPad 8, it was easier because mine has white bezels and there's a black strip in the gap. But on the iPad 9, both the silver and the space gray models come with black bezels, so you can't really see it. The only time I actually notice the difference is when I'm using the Apple Pencil and I'm looking at an angle. Then I can see the separation between the tip of the pencil and the content that I'm creating. On the iPad Air 4, the iPad Pro, and for that matter, the iPad Mini 6, the tip of the pencil looks like it's actually touching the lines that I'm drawing. Now, I'm not an artist, so for me, this difference isn't super meaningful, but I will say that if you're a serious artist and you're buying a device that you plan on using for drawing for the next 5+ years, then I would recommend that you look at a fully laminated display. The more expensive iPads also let you use the 2nd generation Apple Pencil, which you can pair, charge, and store on the side of those iPads. For someone like me, that would be more of a reason to upgrade than the difference between the iPad 9 display and a fully laminated display. Now, there are a couple of other differences that I do want to mention because I think it's important to put them in perspective. First, the iPad 9 has an sRGB display, and the iPad Air 4 and the other current iPads have a P3 display. In case you're not familiar with it, it has a wider color gamut that's able to show more variations of certain colors. Now, can I see the difference if I put the devices side by side? Yes, and if I was using this device for professional photography and videography, this would probably matter to me. But for the types of things that I'm doing, it isn't that meaningful. That's not to say that the other displays aren't better, they are, but it just comes down to whether the difference in color gamut is important enough for the things that you do to justify the higher cost. The 11-inch iPad Pro also has a 600 nits maximum brightness versus 500 on the iPad 9. And another feature to consider on the Pro is the 120 Hz adaptive refresh rate, which Apple calls ProMotion. Is it better than the 60 Hz refresh rate on the iPad 9, the iPad Air 4, and the iPad Mini 6? Absolutely. And can I notice it for a lot of the things that I do? Yes, I can notice it, but I've never navigated on the home screen of the iPad 9 or scrolled down on some web page thinking, oh my god, look at this terrible slow refresh rate. The iPad 9 display is very good, and if I put it next to an iPad Pro, I can tell the difference, but I'm also practically paying 3 times the price, so I expect that one to be better. Now, whenever I think of displays and refresh rate, it always makes me worry about battery life. And I can say that so far, my battery life on the iPad 9 has been very good. Now that I'm about a month in, I'm doing more detailed testing and I can't wait to share them with you. So if you're getting value from this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. Now, before I get to gaming, the camera, and speakers, let's talk a little bit about performance and multitasking. I've been super impressed with the new A13 Bionic chip on the iPad 9, and it has made the user experience on this entry-level iPad outstanding. What's great is that I had no issues with the A12 on the iPad 8. So the fact that I can get better performance for the same price just means that buyers are getting an even better value. Now, if you want a numeric representation of this difference, for single core performance, the iPad 9 scored 1330 versus 1116 on the iPad 8. And for multi-core performance, it scored 3376 versus 2724. I always share those scores because I know a lot of you are interested in them, but benchmarks don't always translate into real life use because they test very specific things under very specific conditions. What I can tell you from my experience is that the iPad 9 is extremely responsive. So whether I'm waking it from sleep, authenticating, opening and closing apps, working with multiple tabs, or doing some photo and video editing, the iPad 9 has been really snappy. I'll get to gaming in just a minute, but when I was working with multiple apps in split view, slide over, and even using the center window, the iPad 9 didn't miss a beat. Of course, it ships with iPadOS 15, so you're getting all the new multitasking functionality as well as all the new widgets and the other features that I covered in this video. Now, one feature that I feel conflicted about is the Lightning port, which sort of ties into accessories. I feel like we can all agree that a USB-C port is better. It offers faster charging, faster transfer speeds, and you can use more powerful accessories. For example, with LumaFusion, you can edit right off of an external SSD without having to copy the files onto your iPad, as long as your iPad has a USB-C port. So if you give me the choice, I'll always go with USB-C. For me, because I'm upgrading from an older iPad and I also use an iPhone, I already have Lightning cables and all the dongles laying around, so I'm glad that I don't have to upgrade those. And I also like the fact that my cases, keyboard cases, and screen protectors are compatible with the iPad 9. So again, the Lightning port hasn't been a real issue for me, and at the same time, I hope that next year we get an iPad 10 and an iPhone with USB-C ports. On both sides of the Lightning port, we see speakers, and these have been pretty good for an entry-level tablet. This is an area where I do notice a meaningful difference between the iPad 9 and the other iPads because the iPad 9 only has speakers on one side. The iPad Mini 6 and the iPad Air 4 have speakers on both sides, so when I'm watching video or playing games in landscape mode, I'm getting stereo sound. The iPad Pro takes things to the next level with 4 speakers, which adjust to how you're holding the device. And it definitely provides a better sound stage than even the iPad Air 4 and the iPad Mini 6. The one advantage that I really like with the iPad 9 is that it still has a 3.5mm headphone jack. So when I want to use wired headphones, I'm good to go and I don't need an adapter. One of my favorite upgrades to the iPad 9 is the front-facing camera, which has been upgraded to an ultra-wide 12 megapixel f2.4 camera with center stage. I covered this in my initial review, but basically the iPad 9 uses the ultra-wide camera and artificial intelligence to identify and then track a subject as it moves through the frame. It then zooms in and out or reframes the shot to make it look like the camera is following the subject, which is really cool. I now use it every single time I'm using FaceTime or Zoom, and it also works for TikTok if you want to use it to create content. Now let's talk about my gaming experience, and then in my recommendation section, I have one extremely important consideration that has to do with gaming, but a lot of people overlook. So playing games on the iPad 9 has been great. I played Call of Duty Mobile, PUBG with frame rate set to extreme, and even Genshin Impact, which I'll come back to later on and you'll see why. As far as performance, the A13 has had no issues, and even with only 3 GB of RAM, I very rarely noticed any lag. For the most part, it's very similar to my experience with the iPad 8, but of course, as time goes on, games are going to become more and more demanding, and I'm always going to opt out to having more processing power than I actually need right now. This is especially true with iPads because Apple has outstanding long-term support. I get a lot of questions about how long an iPad is going to last, so I can tell you that my iPad Air 2, which I got in 2014, is still supported by iPadOS 15, and I use it in every video. If you're going to use the speakers when you game, then I want to point out that sound only comes out of one side of the iPad. For certain games, this hasn't really made a difference other than the fact that it doesn't sound as good or as full as stereo speakers. But for games where it's important to be able to recognize where footsteps are coming from, the iPad 9 isn't the best, again, if you plan on using the speakers. Personally, I use a headset 100% of the time when I'm playing those types of games, and I love the fact that the iPad 9 still has a 3.5mm headphone jack, and I can just plug my headset, get perfect audio, and a better microphone. Of course, there are USB-C headsets available as well, and you can use those with the other iPads, but the majority of my gaming headsets have a headphone jack, and this way I don't need an adapter. Now let's get to my configuration recommendation and the one important factor to consider when it comes to gaming. So as I mentioned in the beginning, Apple sells the 64GB version for $329 and the 256GB version for $479. Of course, these are Wi-Fi models, and you can upgrade to 4G LTE for an additional $130. And that's something that I pretty much never do. I almost always have Wi-Fi available, and when I don't, if I still need to use my iPad and not my phone, I can just tether off my phone. If you're not like me and you plan on using the iPad 9 for mobile gaming or for working in areas where you don't have Wi-Fi, then I would absolutely recommend that you upgrade to the cellular model and get a dedicated data plan. When you're choosing storage size, keep in mind what you need now and what you may need in the future. I know that I can use this device for at least the next 5 years and probably longer, so I would want to make sure that I don't run out of storage. If you're just watching content, using a few apps, surfing the web, and playing a couple of games, 64 gigs should work for you. But if you know that you want a lot of big games installed at the same time, then you may want to consider the larger size. And when you look at games, don't just look at the initial download, but look at any other maps, sounds, or anything else that you may want for the best experience. So a perfect example of this is Genshin Impact, because it shows up as 3.21 gigabytes if you look at the iPad storage section. But then when you want the full version, you're downloading an additional 10 gigs. So even though it still didn't show that number in the app section, look at the total amount that's being used by apps before and then after the install. You'll also want to consider additional storage if you plan on doing any photo or video editing, because you're not going to be able to work off of an external drive. Which brings me full circle to why I think the iPad 9 is such a good value. It's simple. The iPad 9 can easily handle all the types of things that I do. It has a very powerful processor, a better front-facing camera system, and I'm getting double the storage of the iPad 8 for the exact same cost. So I think that if you're looking for an entry-level iPad, it's a fantastic choice. And now that you've learned about the iPad 9, you should see how it compares to the iPad 6. Hopefully this video was helpful. Click on my face to subscribe. You know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.